All right, welcome to the first talk of the afternoon sessions here. It's my great pleasure to introduce Bernhard Schmid, although he probably hardly needs introduction to us around here. Bernhard is professor of political and social philosophy at the University of Vienna. He is the author of 6 monographs, the latest of which is entitled We Together, The Social Ontology of Us, with Oxford University Press 2023, can be accessed here on the display stand. He's also editor or co-editor of 12 volumes, boatload of articles and book chapters in addition. I didn't count. He's also the editor-in-chief of the Journal for Social Ontology. And Bernhard's talk today is entitled The Controversial Subject of the We Mode, Intentions. So please join me in welcoming Bernhard Schmid.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here. This is truly a memorable event, this conference. I did a bit of primitive digital humanities. It's very primitive. Might very well be an artifact. There's lots of artifacts you can generate with Google Ngrams. But this seems to be of Sellars' doing here, this raising concern with we intention. And it did catch on, and what else can we hope? So Kirk said it's best if you want to have success as a philosopher to know about these things. So I know what everything is, but you also need keywords that catch on. And this is a success story, but don't get too excited because there is competitors in the field. There is joint intention which has a long and venerable history. It comes up in connection to contracts, marriage, and all sorts of stuff. Has always been around. There is collective intention, and towering far above all the competitors is shared intention. So this relativizes a little bit this success of the phrase, the term we intention. I take it for the purpose of this talk, and I'm following on Kirk's footsteps here, that we're talking about the same thing under these different labels. Kirk had some reservations that I partly share. Here is a proposal what we are talking about. We're talking about this. We intend to fly, so this is, I take it, attitude in the phonological sense. So Keith yesterday reminded me that, well, in philosophy of language we talk of attitude in the sense of intentional modes, but I mean here intentional attitude. It need not be linguistic, probably. But at least there's no commitment for it to be linguistically structured. Maybe need not be. But there's a thing about the phi. So the phi is the object of intention, it's the intended action, and that's green because there is this distinction between a distribution and a collection. And there's various ways of cashing this out. Kirk introduced it and used it in a sense that's compatible. It's the same as I see it. I would put it in a slightly different way. Perhaps I'd say that in the distributive sense, so like we intend to brush our teeths, where the brushing of teeth is a type of action, and it's various token of one type of action, and that's not what it's meant here. What's being shared here is the token action, so like the handshake. I'm not entirely sure I got the same conception of a handshake as Kirk does, where he sort of stuck out his hand. So there's one activity, It's not me grabbing Kirk's hand and him sticking out his hand towards me, even though this can happen, but it's unfortunate. It's sort of a bit, shouldn't be that way. Normally it's one token act with two agents. So one token act with at least two agents. And I take it that all of these accounts of shared, joint, collective intention, and also we intention, we probably need to talk about this, want to analyze this. What does it mean for us to intend? And I call it a plural action. I think you use the term in the same meaning. A plural action is one token action with more than one participant, more than one agent. So I take this to be uncontroversial. There's another piece I want to introduce, and maybe it's a bit more controversial, but many people accept it. So we intend to find we can meaningfully analyze this in terms of, and this is a piece of phonology here, also if you wish, in terms of subject, mode, and content. So this analysis need not be of the reductive kind. It's not that there are subjects, there are modes, and there are contents, and if they come together, we have intentionality. The subject is an intentional subject, the mode is an intentional mode, and the content is an intentional content. So the analysis is sort of circular, and analyzing intentionality in terms of intentional elements. It's a connective analysis in Strawson's sense. And in our case, of course, the subject is we, the mode is intend to, and the content is the phi. So if we accept this, we can structure the debate a little bit. There is content accounts. And Kirk revealed himself to be a content accounter, or a content accountant, maybe. And here the idea is that we is distributive. It's basically each of us intend to phi, and the phiing is collective. So I should maybe say one word about this collective phi. We shouldn't take it for granted, because much of the history of social science is predicated on the view that there is no such thing as a token collective action. So this is a strong way of reading methodological individualism as introduced by authors such as Schumpeter and Weber, that we shouldn't assume that there are plural actions. So that all action is individual action. And I think the strongest argument in my book, so there's plenty full of received arguments against it, and I think I have a new one, that if you think that plural actions need to be reduced to singular actions, the same reasoning should lead you to deny that there are complex singular actions, because complex singular actions that consist of different components, denying the unity of a plural action entails denying the unity of a complex singular action. So there's just basic acts. You're never preparing a coffee, you're just, taking out the beans, heating up the water, and it's the same with plural action. So of course there's other problems with rationalizing coordination and cooperation, and there is an issue with collective responsibility that speaks strongly in favor of assuming that there is such a thing as plural actions. Now, for the rest of this, I take this for granted that there are plural actions, and we want to analyze how they are intentional. Content accounters say that we distributively intend to phi, and this is a nice analysis because it doesn't force us to assume much in terms of analysis. It's the content, and it's just the content that is collective. And given that we have accounts of singular action and that we want to move from singular action to plural action, which I think is historically totally contingent, but this is how things developed. People had accounts of singular action and they took it to plural action. There is Occam's razor that speaks in favor of content accounts. The big problem with content accounts is that the content accounts usually do not put intention in terms of intention to, but intention that, and which allows them to separate the intentional subject from the agent of the intended action. So in that sense, I can intend that we act together. Seems perfectly grammatical, but it might not be intention in terms of practical commitment. It might need more spelling out in order to get at the sense in which intention is a practical commitment that determines what's going to happen. So for me to intend that we act, there's still a question of what I'm going to do about it. And intention answers that question, what it is I'm going to do about it. That's the sense of intention we want to understand. And we haven't got it in the propositional notation. So if intention is action referential rather than propositional, it seems to be the case that it is action self-referential. So the subject, the intentional subject and the agent of the intended action have to be the same. And there goes the content account. Because it's predicated on the view, the agent is us collectively, the intentional the subject is us distributively. There's something wrong with the content analysis. The straightforward solution to this, I see should, Kirk shaking his head. The straightforward solution, of course, is this. This preserves action self-referentiality of intention, and I should probably repeat this word a couple of times. It's us together that intend to act together. And this takes care of this fundamental issue with content accounts. But it seems that it comes at a price, because why would we like to shake our heads here? This is it seems that there is something new that comes into the picture, and something that we might find metaphysically or politically spooky. Who's that we? Who's we together? I mean, if Jeremy and I go for a walk together, how many subjects are there? It's Jeremy and it's me, and it's certainly not three, right? It's not the us coming with us. And it's not just one, right? We don't lose our... So, the we. Who is the we? Have you met him or her or whatever it is? How does it relate to Jeremy's and my agency and subjectivity? So this is very spooky. Of course, there's a solution in the literature that seems to make this compatible with our basic demands for individuality in our analysis of this phenomenon. And that's to say that, well, it's basically if Jeremy and I associate, we agree on going for a walk. So there is this joint commitment, and this joint commitment is to be explained by each of us joining in. So I say, shall we go for a walk? And Jeremy says, yes, we shall. I'm in, or something like this. And this seems to give this associational model of sharing an intention seems to take care of the metaphysical spookiness. However, the big problem with this solution, well, first of all, it takes a sociologically very contingent way of being together for the universal form. Of course, we like associations because they're voluntary, right? This is how we want to live together in this voluntary way. But it's circular. I find the early social scientists very instructive here in their criticism of contractual theories. So social science, or much of social sciences, originates in the view that there's something wrong about Hobbes, Locke, and all of these others. And the insight that is often found is that, well, they are trying to conceive of all of our acting together in terms of a specific type of acting together that can come about only by means of already acting together. So what is it we're doing, Jeremy and I, if I asked him, well, do you want to go for a walk with me? And he says, yes, we're already communicating. So there's something going on in the coming about of a Gilbertian joint intention that's already joint and intentionally so. So it's circular, the circularity issue with Gilbert's account that, as far as I can see, she never addressed, even though I think it's 25 years now that I occasionally try to raise it, but I think it's fundamental, and it goes back to, don't take it from me, read Tönnies and all of these critics, and Durkheim, the pre-contractual conditions of the contract in Durkheim. That's a strong objection against the one way of making the plural subject of intention non-spooky. So, we're in a dilemma. But haven't we got a third option? Mode accounts. So it's not, there's clearly something wrong with content accounts. They're just not doing enough in terms of collectivity. Subject accounts overdo it in terms of collectivity. Let's keep it to the mode. We intend to phi. So it's us distributively that intend in a collective way to act together. What should we say about this? Let's admit it doesn't look very nice, right? We intend this a bit of, doesn't really look very straightforward. Also, a big problem is that it's very difficult to understand how this is supposed to be a mode. So we know modes. Intend is a mode. Belief is a mode. Fear is a mode. Now this we thing isn't an additional feature to be added to the list. Rather, this we thing, in contrast to the I thing, cuts across the modes. So probably it isn't a mode, right? If it's just a mode, it should be able to be added to the list of modes. But it can't because it cuts across. Also, I mean, we don't have very elaborate understandings of intentional modes anyways. Usually authors just give lists of modes to explain the mode, as if Plato never existed. So what's an intentional mode? Well, it's belief, fear, intention, what have you, and stuff like that. But what I think is the best account of an intentional mode is in terms of formal objects of intention. So the special mode that is fear is in the attitudes ascribing the quality of being dangerous, the formal object, danger, to the target of the attitude. So what the mode modifies is actually the content. But here, with the we, I thing, what's being modified seems to be the subject, right? So this is strange. And this is, So every account has advantages and drawbacks and problems. So let's ask the question, what type of account is Sellars' account? And even though I have spent, I believe, a couple of weeks in 2000 or 2001 reading the relevant texts by Sellars, I haven't gotten the time to get back to them because I got relieved of my administrative duties only 2 weeks ago. And it is with joy that I realize that some of you have written on the topic. I've read Stephanie's paper in the collected volume. I read a bit in your book, The Relevant Passage, which I admire because it contextualizes Sellars' account in the current debate. But I haven't read Keith's piece. Where is he? He's not here. Kyle, yeah. But I shall certainly do so. So in Sellars, there's this thing I raised against Kirk's reading of Sellars, and this is Sellars 68 combined with Sellars 80. I think the full strength of the point that Sellars makes in 68, that intention in terms of practical commitment is in intent to rather than intent that, which means that content accounts are not analyzing intention in terms of practical commitment. They are talking about the wrong kind of stuff, which is, in my view, a rather basic point. And that's spelled out in the 80 paper with the up to the agentness of intention. But I'm open here to different readings. Maybe I'm reading this too strongly, what Sellars says on reasoning about values. And also I'm intrigued by Stephanie's claim that Sellars might have changed his position. And I realized that this was just a presupposition I had when reading this text, that this is an author who would never change his position. I realize now that I might have been rather naive in my reading. But I do find the strongest argument against content accounts in Sellars' writing. Maybe I'm making a big fuss about a couple of sentences, which appear very big to me and very small to other readers, but this is where I stand. I can do no other. Now, is Sellars, so if content accounts fail, there is a strong, prima facie plausibility of subject accounts. And, but we could, of course, read the up to the agentness. This is one of Sellars' ingenious wordings for the phenomenon, for what characterizes intent to. Could we read it weakly, that we intention is simply participant intention? After all, he says time and time again that's individuals who have we intentions. This seems pretty obvious throughout Sellars' writing. Now, such intention is we derivative, another Sellarsian term, from intersubjective intention. All right, but then the question, of course, is, what is intersubjective intention? What about it is shared or shareable? Now, Sellars frightens his readers with using the word logical. So this is a word with which you can frighten people, because you're saying, well, something higher. And he uses logical a lot in connection to intersubjective. And here is another point where I find myself, so this is not how I read Sellars 25 years ago. I did not read him as endorsing Kant. I thought, well, Sellars is exactly right in a critique of Kant's. So the insight is that we cannot stick with the I and then say, well, I is I and everybody else. In a sense, I is only I, but it's also everybody else's I. So there is sort of it's a general thing, like it's a class, the class of rational subjects, or what have you. And I thought, and I found at least one passage in my excerpts where he explicitly says, well, this is what he is doing with the we is exactly not the Kantian thing. It's not, we is not a class of something. It's not a class of I's. So commonality is not generality. It's something very different. It's not a class or a concept. Rather, it's us. But again, hearing a lot of people here reading Sellars in a very Kantian way, I'm sort of, maybe I should read again, or at least complete the reading of Jeremy's book, at least. But of course, you might entertain the thought that intersubjective intention, so that from which we intention is derived, maybe that's just group intention, and I found this in Jeremy's book. And Jeremy, in the section on we intention, you mentioned this 76 letter, which discusses cases such as China fears Russia. And I find this letter, so I found it online, but now I found it again as the very last pages in the mastodontic, I hope the word exists, edition of Sellars' texts that you find on the bookshelf to the left. But Sellars, Jeremy, you say in the chapter, there might be some controversy about this, and I find that Sellars here puts mental states ascribed to groups in inverted commas. And here is a quote, a 1980 quote. It must also be carefully borne in mind that although the core concept of a group intention and a group action is a perfectly legitimate one, the action we referential intentions we are considering are intentions had by individuals. And here is an early statement. I need scarcely add that the fact that this is so does not involve the existence of a group mind capable of having beliefs and intentions in a sense incompatible with empiricist principles. Empiricism is properly stressed the logical dependence of concepts pertaining to the beliefs and attitudes of groups on the corresponding concepts pertaining to individuals. So empiricism got that right. So I don't think this is a subject account, and clearly there's no attempt to endorse a view according to which we intentions or the intersubjective intentions from which they are derived are collectively subjective. So this brings me to the view that Sellars might be the arch-we-moder. I wish to emphasize that when the concept of a group is internalized, so it's not something out there or in addition that intends or anything like that, it's internalized as the concept of us. It becomes a form of consciousness, in particular a form of intending. this is 56. Intersubjectivity is a matter of the subjective form of intention, 68. And also shall I and shall we is just very much looks like the mode. And the we mode, indeed, let's not forget that the we mode is another neologism that Sellars invented, right? I checked with Google Ngram. No we mode before Sellars. And, of course, another point, Tuomila and Searle, following on Sellars' tracks, Tuomila uses the expression we mode, and Searle sticks to the term collective form of intending. He uses the form parlance, but this seems to be equivalent. I asked what Tuomila told me that, it's a we mode, but can't really say what's a mode. If you pressed him, he said, well, it's got to do with group reasons, so change the topic. But then with group reasons, it's not a good move because you want to allow for cases where people intentionally engage in joint action for different reasons. And also, in virtue of what is a reason, a group reason, so the issues come up, it's changing the topic. I don't think it was a good move, but he does not address the elephant in the room of what kind of mode is the we mode. So I think this is, Sellars has driven the debate and he pushes a mode account, but there's something deeply fishy with the mode account. So also, in support of my way of reading Sellars, I should address, to conclude this, an issue concerning, because authors do not write in isolation, right? They've gotten their questions from somewhere, and I'm willing to tell you from where I got my way of asking the question. And I think it matters very much for this particular question where we think that Sellars got his idea from. And there is a bit of a controversy around this. So yesterday, Heath, I believe, said that, well, this is an attempt to grapple with this Durkheimian thing. And in the early 2000s, David Schweikart and I, we wanted to find out about Sellars, because Sellars never talks about his sources for some reason, or rarely at least. So we wrote an email to Bruce Awney, and we asked Bruce Awney, where did Sellars get the idea of we intention, etc. from? And Bruce Awney wrote back and said that the source is Collingwood 41. So this is the new Leviathan, or Man Society, Civilization and Barbarism, a book from 41. Now, and we published this in the Stanford, proudly published this in the Stanford Encyclopedia. Along came Stephen Turner with his colleague Olin, and they now claim that the source is Durkheim via Bugli, Durkheim's successor on the first sociology chair, who had written a book on Durkheim's views. Sellars' mom translated the book, Sellars' daddy wrote an introduction, and Sellars himself read the book and underlined some passages. And this is sort of, Turner calls this the smoking gun. There's a smoking gun here, this book, so this must be where Sellars had it from. And of course, we need not stage a controversy here, because it may be that Sellars had multiple sources. But I would like to point out that Sellars' views, and indeed his ways of putting them, are very close to Collingwood's. So we find the phrasing and the topics in Collingwood, whereas he does not endorse, even though implicitly he rejects the core tenets of Durkheimian conscience collective in his writing. So, for example, I already quoted the passage on internalized groups. So this is the opposite of what Durkheim does, where social facts are external and they have coercive force. So this is, even though Sellars, or maybe Turner, because Turner also did underline in the book himself, somebody underlined these passages, but an underline is not an endorsement. So, and here is a quote from Collingwood, and I'm going to conclude with a couple of quotes from Collingwood. Society is the sharing of certain persons in a practical social consciousness, and the practical consciousness is intent to, rather than intent that, as we shall see in Collingwood. Verbally expressed in a formula like, we will go for this walk. Yes, walking together has its origin in Collingwood, the paradigm case of doing something together. Or, we will sail this boat. And here clearly talking about token action rather than a type of action. This plural action is the topic here. In this formula, the word we expresses the social character of the consciousness. The word will is practical. Its practical character, the concluding words are a definition of the common enterprise. Here is Collingwood on plural action. Social activity is a sharing of activity between different agents. The activity shared, still figuring in the consciousness of those agents, is a single, undivided activity, not a case of I do this and you do that, but a case of we do this, a this which comprises both the this and the that. And here is, Collingwood on sharing. Let us be careful. There is a distinction between owning in severalty, where that which is owned is divided into shares, and owning jointly where there is no such division. It is true that persons sharing an apple commonly divide it. But what about persons sharing a horse or a friend or an umbrella? Here, to divide would be to destroy. And a kind of sharing is devised to meet the case where there is no division. I don't know about sharing a flat. I think you still need a room of your own. This at least is my concept of sharing. That a flat, you don't divide the apartment up, but there's common space, but still there needs to be some separation. So it's probably a combination of the two ways of sharing. There's a distributive sharing, where the unity that is being shared is dissolved by the sharing, and there is contributive sharing, where the unity that is shared is constituted by the sharing. So this is the distinction that Collingwood wants to capture here, and I think it's nicely done, even though the apartment case, also maybe with the horse, I don't know enough about horses too. So here a couple of more quotes from Collingwood, because I assume that many of you have been misled by Olin Turner into reading a lot of Durkheim instead of reading a lot of Collingwood. So some more Collingwood for you, on the hypothesis that this might be helpful to understand what Sellars is about to do with his we intention. What then do I call a society? It is a kind of community, but what kind? Every community is a community because there is something that its members share. What the members of a society share is social consciousness. And mind you, there is a lot of consciousness talk in early Sellars when he talks about we-intention. If men are the only animals that can be, strictly speaking, members of a society, yes, he says men. Also, let's not get too deeply into the barbarism that Collingwood discusses in the book. It's a very historical book. But there's interesting stuff. Maybe not at the end. But, yeah. So, members of society, that is because they are the only animals which have and can therefore share a social consciousness, or which comes to the same thing, a will. So Tomasello would endorse this. You know, there's a sharing of will that's unique to humankind, we would call it, rather than men. Social consciousness, like all forms of consciousness, is primarily a practical consciousness, not a making up your mind that, but a making up your mind to. And here we find this distinction that's stated repeatedly in the New Leviathan again. And my hunch is that this is where Sellars got it from. Of course, there's a question of, well, if this is, how would Sellars have stumbled across this Collingwood stuff? I think that Arne said that Sellars had studied with Collingwood in, was it Oxford? But still the question would be, well, why does it come up so late? I mean, there is, if it comes up in 56, is that true? Is that the first time it comes up? There's still 15 years gap between the publication of the New Leviathan and Sellars picking up on it. But take it from me, as a person who's getting a bit older, 15 years is not that long. You might get back, well, I'm getting back 25 years in this talk. So yeah, there is gaps. Also, I mean, as compared to, mind you, Bouglé is 26. Yeah, I mean, this clearly, the gap issue isn't unique to the Collingwood hypothesis. It's even more glaring in the for the more of a problem for the Durkheim hypothesis, because we're talking about a much wider gap between 26 and 56. It's 30 years. That's twice the gap that my hypothesis has to bridge somehow. So I hope I've strengthened a little bit the view of Sellars as a person who tries to devise the we mode as a way out of the obvious insufficiency of content accounts without getting into the metaphysical and spookiness and the political morass of subject accounts. So, mind you, these people, they were around when the issue around whether it's going to be communism, fascism, or democracy was still pretty much open and fought out in everyday politics. So, my hunch is that there's political commitment here. You know, this is not going to be a class consciousness that's going to dictate what's going to happen. And it's not going to be the spirit of a people. So we're not going to put our noses into these conceptions. And I think that's what's driving the a bit desperate, admittedly, attempt to devise the we mode. But of course, once we investigate what it is, it sort of crumbles, right? It seems to devolve into, well, either it's content or it goes to the right way, and it's subject, because clearly. So for a long time I did endorse sort of this mode talk, but then I came to think about what kind of mode is the we mode, and I realized, well, it's not a mode. Let's face it. What does it modify? It modifies the subject, and maybe it is the subject. And there's another insight that I had, that there's not much literature on the intentional subject. Like Searle, for example, says, well, I don't have a theory about the intentional subject. And by the way, he said, yeah, with form he means mode. He said that. But there's a thing that I think philosophers learned about the I. So if I'm gonna go for a walk by myself, it's not me and my ego. But the same sort of worry that we might have with Jeremy and me together, we should also have with regards to me alone. So what's my ego doing in my action? And we have come to learn that this is a misconception. So the intentional subject is not a proprietor of the intention or a substance that has the intention as an attribute. Rather, it is, and that sounds modish now, it is the way in which attitude is subjective, in which attitude is someone's. That way is the subject. So if you absolutely insist on calling it the mode, then by all means, but don't put it into the mode place like as an index to the mode. That's not a good thing. And distinguish it from intentional modes. So it is the subject. The way in which an attitude is, someone's attitude is the subject. That way is the subject. So the mistake we made about the ego, we are now constantly making about the we. As if the we was sort of a substantial entity that has a collective intention as its property. But there's simply no reason to assume so. Well, maybe there's a bit of a reason because we do artificially create agents, and maybe we want to say, well, it's something similar we do, but it's just an absurd conception. So I would say Sellars is, the way I view it, he's the best philosopher of collective intentionality. He has basic insight. He recognized what's wrong with content accounts. He had an understandable suspicion against subject accounts that prevented him from going the right way. Eventually, he came closest, even though he didn't quite get there. Because the right account, of course, is a subject account. It's a straightforward thing. So I went quicker than I meant to. I don't have anything more to say. So, thank you.
I don't know where to start. But maybe I can start at the end because I don't want to, get into the content account. I thought there was a false premise in your objection, but set that aside. And maybe just a quick remark about Gilbert. I don't actually think she's a subject theorist. I think it's a mode of speaking. She talks about the plural subject. I once asked her about it, and she said, no, it's not a real subject. It's just a way of talking about how people have a joint commitment. But I don't understand the last bit about the subject being the way the attitudes are had. Because that sounds like if the subject is, are we thinking of it as what the subject term picks out? Then it just seems like it's got to be a category mistake of some sort. We is a referring term, which is now a group which includes the person using it. But that's not a way. So anyway, please help me with that.
Yeah. So I take it's not a referring term, and I realized I got pushback from already on this conference from Bill. But yeah, here I stand. I don't think I am in pain is object use of I, doesn't pick out, doesn't refer. It's expressive. It doesn't make sense for you to ask me, well, whom am I talking about if I say I'm in pain? Well, damn, it's I. There's no question. So this element of self-identification, and I argue in the book, that's the central aim, to argue for plural self-identification. It's that I. It's not referential. It doesn't pick out. It's not conceptual. So that's the thing about Gilbert. So while the way I view this, I had some conversations with her during a time at which she renounced plural subject theory as a label. But now I find it, and she uses a lot of emulation talk in her writings. In the Joint Commitment book, I think the word emulation occurs 85 times. We emulate a plural subject. But, emulation of what? Still offers plural subject. So I would say that this is a plural subject account that tries to take care of anti-collectivist worries at a great price. So I do not think it's a stable position, because you cannot explain joint intentional activity through a particularly complex joint intentional activity, namely the coming to jointly endorse a project, which is already jointly intentional. So there I see the big problem in the circularity thing. But I would say that she's quite clear in this being an intention or a commitment that's ours jointly. So I would take her on her word, and that would be the plural subject. And she continues to use the label plural subject theory. So I would say I would do her a great injustice if I were not to label her as a plural subject account, since she uses the label plural subject all the time.
A quick follow-up. So if I'm in pain, someone's in pain. I'm not expressing pain when I say that. I'm just a conditional statement. But of course, that's going to be obviously true. But of course, it involves quantifying, recognizing that the subject position there is referential. So, it's indisputable that I is used to refer to an individual in any context, whether or not it's conjoined with a psychological predicate or not. And I think you can give similar semantical arguments for use of we being univocal across all the contexts in which it appears. So you've got to look at all the logical implications of these things. So anyway, that's going to be a semantical argument on that side. Yeah, the thing about Gilbert is I think it turns out that she's not really committed to individuals having any attitudes to be jointly committed to something. It can be a purely normative condition.
Yeah.
And so
except that they need to agree. So that's still saying something about what's actually going on. But the intention is a normative status. Yeah. So
well,
it doesn't go away simply because each of us has other thoughts in the mind.
Yeah, but what would be on that view for us to be, for us to intend would be for us to be jointly committed to act insofar as we can as a single body that intends. That would be the formula. And the joint commitment just comes down to each of us is obligated to participate in that activity, that is acting insofar as possible, so as to emulate a single body that intends that such and such. And there it's an agreement it's essentially mutual obligations between the two individuals. So the only ontology there involves the two individuals. So I think that there's no subject there other than the two individual subjects.
Yeah, so how does it come about? By me expressing my conditional personal willingness to be jointly committed if you do likewise. So that's a process in which it comes about, and that needs actually to happen. So it's not a normative structure that comes out of nowhere, but a specific process. Now, my emphasis is that this process has to be jointly intentional. So that's the criticism. That's where it becomes petitio principii, where you want to intend explain what it means to be jointly committed through a process of jointly committing. And it's also, another thing is that it is an especially complex process because it involves communication. Now, surely this is not the most basic way of doing stuff together, the talking or the... So that's the issue. How metaphysically deep this is, I understood her as saying, well, the commitment is ours, so that only we together can undo it. It's not that, it's sort of, it is between us, but it is between us as one. So there we might disagree a little bit. And also concerning the pain, I must say I didn't understand all the terms that you said. But surely there's a difference between, so the old Wittgenstein thing, you see a photograph and you think, on that photograph I'm in pain. There clearly, this is the I as object. You mean that one, and you might be mistaken. Well, I can ask you, is it really you're thinking about? Because I recognize that you're another person on the photograph. But that's different from the expressive use, where I wouldn't, if you say I'm in pain, I assume you're not looking at the photograph, so I won't ask you, are you sure it's you? So, I find philosophical, I think this distinction matters a great deal between, self-predication, self-conceptualizing, and we saw it coming up in the last talk, where it's the worry about how to conceive of ourselves that drives people into straying away from the right original project. And I feel like we don't need to do this once we got the indexical we right. Give it a shot, read the book.
If
So
I'm in pain, somebody's in pain. Somebody's in pain. The inference works only if that last statement realizes the antecedent of the conditional, but it is a valid inference.
I think 5 more hands up here. In the interest of time, can we move on? So I have Steffi next, and then Glenda and Preston, and then Bill and Heath, you also had your hands up, is that right? So Steffi, please, go ahead. Anyone else?
I have a clarification about your own account. You had only space to talk about this very briefly, so this is maybe due to this confined space. You're still talking about somebody's having an attitude, right? When you say the subject is the way in which attitudes are subjective, so somebody's, right? And I'd like to clarify what the role of this somebody. So is it okay to ask who this somebody is who has the attitude in your account? And would that differ in the case of I intending and we intending, who that somebody is?
It is a necessary question. So I don't think that we need to have a conception of who we are in order to share an attitude. Just as I do not need to have any conception of who I am in order to have an attitude. But personally, I better know who I am when it comes to exactly determine what it is I'm going to do and how it is I'm going to do it. I better know who I am, like, what's my role in society and all of that. What are my objective properties? I better know in order to act efficiently. And it's the same for us. So in order to do something rationally, we cannot just let things spontaneously evolve. And for that, the first step is conceptualization. So organization, in terms of an activity, the first step is conceptualization. Because it's so basic, it's no wonder that we tend to think this is really the basic thing of what it means to be an intentional subject. It's a concept. But it's not the basic thing. It comes as an additional thing. And it's certainly more complicated in the plural case, where, so in the individual case, it's accounting for your relevant predicates and a social role and so on. In the plural case, it's often a assignment of roles. And for that, you need to know who's in and why. You need a concept. But these conceptions are parochial and or conceptually imperialistic. So they do not account for all of us. Because what all of us want to do is living well together. That's it, and that's one token action. So this, all this universality, it's just we live together, and we have been doing so for a long time, and we don't do it well. So it's that one token action, but in order to organize ourselves, we need to, who do we mean with regards to this task, who's in and who's out, and then we need these conceptions, but they tend to fail. And but failure is, once you realize that there is this preconceptual we, this becomes a different issue, because now the issue is how can we keep conceptions of who we are open towards what's going on preconceptually. So criticizing self-conceptions that on which organization is based, like criticizing basically politics is doing that. Right? We structure society, we determine roles. And that becomes now the task of ethics and ultimately of philosophy, to point out that, the preconceptual and the conceptual are different levels. And there is a basic level that needs to be accounted for as far as possible in the conceptualization. I'm probably strayed far away from your question. And I wanted to learn from you about your view that Sellars ends up with a content account at the end, given what I read about up to the agedness in 1980, where it all ends, if I'm not mistaken. So,
Glenda next, and then Preston.
So I take it that you're proposing that we can think what Sellars is saying not so much as an advocate of the we mode, but at the subject, right? And I find that very suggestive, but I do have maybe a question of something that it didn't seem to me that you addressed it. So, of course, one of the things that Sellars says is that each one has their own token intention. There is no commitment to the idea that is one token intention that is shared by many, so that when we say we intend, we actually say that I intend, you intend, and what we share is the content of those intentions. So I wanted to I think this clashes with something, or so do you think this is a problem that Sellars has? So is it possible to act from the perspective of the we subject, and yet is that like I intention? It seems to me that doesn't satisfy where you started with, which is the idea of the plural action as one token action of more than one agent.
Yeah, so I'd say so I take it from Jeremy that we intention is participant intention, and that's we derivative, and there is this thing, I think the label intersubjective intention does occur in Sellars.
Yeah.
And that's the I forgot the term, even though Kyle taught me yesterday, but I forgot already, the base from which we intention is derived. So what's that attitude? That's That's we intend. And I take it this is a token attitude. It's one attitude in which all of us participate. And from that, I and you derive our participatory we intention. So the intersubjective intention is really intersubjective, straightforwardly. It is us intending. And it's so there's a story then to be told, well, what exactly is the feature and virtue of which an intention is someone's intention? And I develop it as self-consciousness. And there's plural self-consciousness. So this consciousness talk in early Sellars I take on board, but I reconstruct it in terms of self-consciousness. There's plural pre-reflective self-consciousness. And it's a form of unity of mind. So mindedness is being shared between us, but we also have it individually. So, and we derive, as participants, we derive our participatory intention from the shared intentional attitude. That would be the story. It's straightforward. Yeah, we together intend, and that's how mindedness is actually shared. Yeah, we need not individuate minds according to bodies. There's lots of social structures according to which mind is individuated. It's a group.
Very briefly, just come back. When he discusses moral intentions, he does say that the fact that a moral community doesn't exist is not an obstacle for me to act in the thinking of the moral community. So would that mean, I don't know how, maybe this is an issue of whether there is a change in Sellars' view or not and what text corresponds to each view, but he does seem to think that it's possible to act with the eyes of a universal community, even if this community doesn't exist.
Yeah, I'd say, so, and the previous speaker had this formulation, and sort of look at things on behalf of a group. But that's still, it's not the right stuff. So it's not that I imagine myself into somebody else. It's actually us. So like, we waste the environment, right? We pollute our planet and make it inhabitable by each of us doing something and nobody thinking about what is it we're doing together, right? So it's not a joint intentional action to waste the environment. But it's a failure to do so. And so morality is pointing out that we are actually, there's a plural action of waste, and it's not an intentional action, but it's a plural action that we're wasting the planet, but now becoming aware of it, we all know, even though none of us knows who exactly is in and why, it's not, the rational creatures or the public reasoners waste the environment or any of that, not even humanity. You might think of the cows, they are farting, are they in? It doesn't really matter. But we become aware of this being an issue, even though we didn't do it intentionally. It's sort of, we're in it in terms of failing agency rather than in terms of proper intentional agency. So this is how I think a proper Sellarsian view should be, that we're just not doing the one token action that we're doing, which is living together. We're not doing it well. And to point that out is the issue, is the ethical perspective. It's just about one action. It's not that each of us in C should. This is the way we want to take care of it being done better. But it's not the basic thing. The basic thing is that we're living together badly. We should do it well, but we don't do so. It becomes something very, very simple. But you have to swallow that this might be one token action, a huge thing. And you might think, well, brushing my teeth, that's an action, but not that whole history and all, that's too big. But then I'd say, well, why not? To me, it seems to resolve a lot of issues in ethics and meta-ethics and meta ethics.
Preston next, and then Bill, you had your hand up too, right? So Preston first, then Bill, then Heath.
So I'm not sure how much the difference between intending that to is a really substantial difference, so long as that clause includes a reference to an agent doing something. But I want to go back to this issue of Gilbert and raise it as a way of like my sort of growing concern with the distinction between subject mode and content accounts. I mean, I've made reference to this too, and it's a useful way of framing things at one level of generality. But then, I mean, something that comes out here now and that is raising my worry is that maybe it's just not adequately capturing what's going on, in part because, to use a Wittgensteinian example, you know, it's as if we've each got our own thing in this opaque jar and we talk about it, but we're using the terms differently. So Kirk, in his characterization of Tumela, gave it as a content account. You were giving it as a mode account. You were treating Gilbert as a subject account. You were saying when you spoke to Gilbert, she was willing to characterize it as a content account. When I spoke to Gilbert, mode account. When I spoke to Gilbert, she said she was willing to take it as a subject account, but I glossed it in terms of a Kantian subject of judgment. It's a condition on the possibility of engaging in a certain kind of activity, not an ontological thing, but a form of judgment. So look, there's all these different ways of characterizing mode, content, and subject. How useful is it to keep thinking in those terms? Can we just drill through and talk about the phenomenon? Do we need to characterize it in terms of, I mean, again, at the level of generality that's involved in, like, here's a way, like, when I teach this stuff, I start by talking about content, mode, and subject, and then I give a really simple gloss. But now I'm wondering, maybe once that first class is done, I should just, like, stop talking about it.
Well, you still need it for the first class. I'm very
For the
proud
first class, that's fair. But, you know, when we're
No,
you know,
I'm fully aware.
Here.
You know, this distinction didn't exist before we put it there. I think, honest. So I hope you find it useful for your purposes. It has limits because there is no such thing as a reasonable V-mode account. I think we can agree on that. And with content accounts, I think they devolve. They are not stable either. They devolve into singularist accounts. Because after all, what's it that you can settle by whatever it is you have in mind? That's what you're going to do, Preston.
Here's a way of putting my worry, and then I'll shut up and let other people go on. I suspect that the three of us at least would agree about a lot of these things if we drop that terminology, whereas when I hear you say, well, the content account makes sense of it, I know that Kirk's going to disagree with that. When you say that you think the mode account doesn't have anything going on, you know, I kind of think there's a way of spelling out the notion of mode which doesn't make it crazy. And when you say you think a subject account is the way to go, I immediately think to myself, well, yeah, but the obvious way to read that is that it's like an ontological subject, and then it seems like that's kind of crazy. And so it just seems to me if we just push all of that stuff to the side, we can just talk about the phenomenon, and then maybe we would have more to agree on.
Yeah, but I think I hear you. But I cannot recommend this as a strategy for publishing philosophy papers, because journals they want to hear how you think, because it's not, you know, philosophy is not something you do alone in Radec Králové. Even though some people did something like this, it's not a singular activity, you know, it's something we do together. And this requires of us to account, and I didn't just push my stuff on you. I try to sort of motivate it in the light of what I see around, and I think we should do that because it's a joint intentional activity, even though we conceive of it in very different terms, and we certainly don't agree concerning who's in and who's out, you know, who's a philosopher. But it doesn't prevent the joint intentional activity from going on. But I do think that it requires of us that we account for what others have been doing in the history and what contemporaries are doing. And we should devote enough time on reading them and sort of reflecting their work in what it is we are contributing to the debate. This is and I'm certainly guilty of not having read enough. Try to acknowledge this at the beginning. These people have contributed to this. And I haven't spent the time of reading this. It's really bad. And I think it makes philosophy worse because we write too much and we don't read enough. But then you might say, yeah, well, this creates redundancy because, and I must say I'm a bit proud that people tend to pick up on the content mode subject thing. I think this, when Kirk said, well, it's a content account, I said, oh, that's a good thing. Might have picked the wrong box, but still. And it has limits, yeah. It certainly has limits.
So officially we are 70 minutes in, but we started a little earlier than we thought we would. So if we can do it quick, we have 3 more questions. So Bill next, and Heath, and Bill Ringe, but let's try to keep it compact.
I'm not sure I can do it quick, so I'll yield to my time.
Heath?
If I understand the objection to the content account right, it's that the content is attributing intentions to an individual, but the intention is to do a collective action, and that individual can't do the collective action, so that's the problem. All right. Here's an argument that it's okay, and you tell me what the matter is. Suppose that we're going to do something together, like play a game of chess. And my part of that is to move the white pieces, and your part of that is to move the black pieces, and we take turns like you do. And Jeremy comes up to me and says, hey, Heath, why are you moving those white pieces around the board? And I say, well, I'm playing a game of chess with Bernhard. And it seems to me that to explain the reasoning behind why I'm doing the thing that I individually am doing, moving white pieces, I have to be doing that with the intention of doing the collective action, playing a game with you.
So you want to say that the wording that we put actions often in terms of I do it with, that this shows that that we can intend.
Yeah, if you model out my practical reasoning, yeah, the immediate thing I'm doing is by myself moving the bishop to g4 or whatever. But the next step in my practical reasoning, the intention with which I'm doing that, is to play a game of chess, which is a plural action.
But do you need to account for the plural action at all to answer Jeremy's question? Because you could say, well, I'm moving these around because I'm playing chess.
Yeah, and I can't play chess by myself.
Yeah, but you need not even quote, you need not assume that, well, somehow I intend our acting in order to answer Jeremy's question, right? You could stick to yourself. What is it you're doing? Well, I'm playing chess. Even though, of course, playing chess is sort of... Yeah.
But so you don't think that I am intending a plural action when I'm intending to play chess?
You can't, in terms of practical commitment.
I can't.
You can't. I mean, there's situations when you're the appointed leader of the group where it's going to be you who's... and by the way, Sellars discusses this, the influence condition on reasoning about value, and he calls it a superficial thing, and then he discusses the up to the agentness. So whenever you are of great influence, what's on your mind determines what we are going to do. So Jeremy, our leader, intends for us to go to the souk tonight, and he's in a position to do so. Now you could say, well, this is extended individual agency. I tend to think, well, this is in virtue of us intending to spend this conference according to taking into sufficient account what the organization is going to propose in terms of a program. So it's actually in virtue of us giving, in our intention, assigning some authority, not unlimited, but some authority to Jeremy that he is in the position of doing so. So this leader intention that seems to extend into other people's agency is actually derivative from the basic case of team intention. This is how we're going to spend these couple of days by the organizer having a special role.
I'm not convinced by the argument against the mode account. So it sounds as though the argument was, look, to have a distinctive mode, you need a distinctive formal object, but obviously that can't be the case with collective intention because, you know, it's both, in both cases, it's you know, and individuals and groups can intend the same actions. So here's a thought you might have about a less controversial case. So sort of think about the difference between hope and joy, right? Okay. Now, those are distinct modes. One thing people sometimes want to say is, okay, well, the formal object of hope is future good, and the formal object of joy is present good, right? But, like, those can't be two distinct things, right? Okay. It's got to be the case that, you know, if I'm hoping for something, yeah, and then it comes about, and I feel joy, I'm feeling joy about the very same thing, right? So it's got to be that when we sort of characterize these goods, the formal object in one case is good. I mean, in both cases, the formal object's got to be the good, but just under different aspects, right? Okay. If that's right, it does look as though you can have different modes having the same formal objects, provided they sort of access them in different ways, or they... if you make that move, why isn't there an analogous move open to the sort of we mode? Yeah? Of course, you know, they're both sort of have as their formal objects actions. But they access those same formal objects in different kinds of ways. So why is sort of the I and the we not like the present and the future?
Yeah, because, so, I mean, by all means, I would see such a paper making that claim that we actually can account for the I-we mode distinction in terms of a formal object of the content of intention or what have you. But surely it's different from the distinction between, so unless you want to argue that I intention and we intention are different as are hope and joy. So these are qualitatively different. And I'm not entirely sure I never even considered the possibility of there being qualia that are specific for the groupish thing. So I'm not as much a phenomenologist as to seriously think that, you know, that the qualia are different. But they are different in hope and joy, right? Hope is this, you know, longing thing that sort of feels different from joy, and I intend, we intend. I think the difference is in the way it is ours, and that's a matter of self-awareness. But this is the first I heard from a philosopher seriously entertaining the thought that we might account for the I-we distinction in terms of formal object, and I'm highly intrigued. Well, you know, the target can be the same. Oh, yeah, well, I shouldn't.
He didn't account for the I-we distinction in terms of the formal object. He said the formal object can be the same, and it's precisely the mode that is different. So the I-we distinction isn't made in terms of the formal object, it's made in terms of our relation to the object. And our relation is, in the one case, they're both mental acts, right? And modes are mental acts of some kind, and they're different mental acts: hope, fear, belief, desire, intending. And why not think that a we intention is simply, since the we functions there as an adverb, that there are two ways of intending. At least there's the generic notion of intending, but then we can intend in the we mode, which entails certain other kinds of ways in which that might then be allow derivations of further particular actions. It might have some other connections. And there's intending in the I mode, which again might have still other implications about how it is to be exercised, and how it might conflict with other parts of my situation, but that the we simply is adverbial upon the verb intend.
So, okay, I'm not sure, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but I thought that I brought up the issue of formal objects because they account for modes. So different mode, different formal object. So I thought that you were maybe proposing that the I-we thing might be a mode in that sense, but then we need different formal objects. Because, you know, it's the danger that makes the fear, loosely speaking. And it's the good, the future good that makes the hope, and what have you. So if you want to say, and that's mode, right? Mode is of the content in terms of formal object. And that's content, right? Formal object is a property ascribed to the target in virtue of which the attitude is of the mode of attitude it is. So if you want to do that with I-we seriously, and this is new to me, but I'm excited, then you need additional formal objects, and I just don't see how this is going to fly. Because the I-we distinction cuts across the modes. There is I intend, there is we intend. So it's not a continual list of modes. Rather, it's the modes, and then there is I-we. So probably it's not the same.
I mean, I think you have to be very... Sorry.
Thank you very much.